So it is a great pleasure to have with us Professor Sakis Gekas from York University, Toronto, together with Professor Lucien Frary from Rider University, New Jersey, and Dr Chrysovalantis Kyriacou from the Bank of Cyprus Cultural Foundation to discuss the ways a free Greece was imagined in the two ends, so to speak, of the Greek-speaking world, the Ionian Islands and the island of Cyprus, at the meeting points, that is, of different empires and different imperial and colonial schemes. The British and the Russian in the Ionian Islands, the Ottoman in the island of Crete. We take as our point of departure the famous Ionian Academy, which was established by Frederick North, the 5th Earl of Guilford, purportedly being the first university established on Greek soil in 1824, operating up until 1827. And our event will therefore seek to explore the history of cultural, intellectual movements that have been related or relate actually to the Greek War of Independence, including the contribution of the Greek Orthodox Cypriots. It is for that reason a great pleasure that Professor Sakis Gekas, Hellenic Heritage Foundation Chair in Modern Greek History at York University, will give the main lecture, a 40 to 45-minute speech on Lord Guilford, British cultural politics, and colonialism in the Ionian Islands. He will then be followed by two 10-minute long interventions by Professor Lucien Frary from Rider University, New Jersey, on Russophilia in the Ionian Islands and the coming of the Greek Revolution. And we will then turn for another short 10-minute long intervention to Dr Chrysovalantis Kyriacou from the Bank of Cyprus Cultural Foundation, and actually a graduate of Royal Holloway, who will briefly talk on the Cypriots and the Greek War of Independence. The interventions will then be followed by a couple of rounds of discussion, comments, questions between the panelists before we open the virtual floor or the screen to the public. Let me conclude by saying that this event was originally conceived by Professor Richard Clogg, whom we are happy to welcome today. And all of us, therefore, at the Hellenic Institute would actually like to dedicate the event to him as an expression of appreciation for his enormous, actually, contribution in modern Greek studies, both in the United Kingdom as well as internationally. Professor Clogg, thank you for joining us. It is therefore a great pleasure to welcome a good and old friend, actually, Sakis Gekas, an authority on the British Mediterranean and the history of the Ionian Islands, with interests that span the history of the middle classes, colonial state formation, cultural politics in that part of the world. Saki, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It is great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Patty, Professor Detrinos as well, and everyone at Royal Holloway for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to be giving this talk. I will try and share the screen for a minute. See, does it work? Okay, great. I would like to start by, first of all, as I said, thank you all very much for this very honorable invitation. It is also a great pleasure to revisit one of the least explored aspects in the study I did on the Ionian Islands a few years ago. But it's also great to go back to the place where I studied in Corfu, and as some of you may know, most of you might not. I'm a graduate of the Ionian University, a direct successor, as the university claims, and it is to a very large extent, of the Ionian Academy, both of the first one in the early 19th century, but also the one I'll be speaking more about of the 1820s. So it is also that I have a personal connection, so to speak, to this Ionian University heritage and Ionian Academy. It's something you are being told, as at least we were told back in the distant 1990s, that this is sort of a successor of the first Ionian University, and then of course you learn over time about Lord Guilford as well. It is the case that the opening of the Ionian Academy in Corfu is often presented as the personal project of Frederick North, the Lord, the Earl of Fifth Earl of Guilford. Now, this is definitely the case, but there is a local and, of course, imperial colonial context of British colonialism in particular that explains how the institution came about. And I'm not going to talk, fortunately, perhaps, as much as I would like to about the Greek Revolution and its connection to the institution, because that would take too much of our time. But there is certainly a moment, a co-terminal moment, when the university is founded and the Greek Revolution rages on across the Ionian Sea. It is also the fact that in some cases, as I discovered while writing parts of what became later the book on British colonialism in the Ionian Islands, that there was not always a connection between the first Ionian Academy of the early 19th century and the Ionian Academy of the 1820s. And that was missing something that was not just sort of a connection of going back to the original academy, so to speak, but it was missing a whole milieu, intellectual, social, and political, in fact, that explains how the initiative, the vision of Frederick North came about. It is also very important for me, and I would like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to revisit one of the sort of still not as important in the historiography chapters of the British Ionian encounter, to use a phrase that Tom Galland used in his book on the Ionian Islands and British colonialism, and that is education. And so while I'm going to refer to the Ionian Academy and its founder, Lord Guilford, there is, as I said, a local and imperial context that cannot be ignored if we are to understand the opening of the Academy in that place and time. I would also like to suggest that the institution presents a shift in the colonial practices and mode of rule from the military commercial to the cultural civilizational, still at an early stage in the empire's history of cultural politics and education. And I know Greek historians or historians of modern Greece, we have a sort of allergy to exceptionalism. We would like to, as we rightly think, to like to place it sort of in a broader context. But I think that in this case, there is truly something quite exceptional in the opening of the first, actually, university in what became later modern Greece, but still, of course, is the British protectorate. There is also, I'm going to refer very briefly to this literature, there is a relationship, a discussion rather, about the attention that historians should give to the contribution to the relationship between empire and education. And while there is an article on the Oxford History of the British Empire, for example, even that volume developed included very little material specifically on education. And at the same time, substantial literature has developed on the ways in which ideas and practices of education in Britain influence the character of education in different parts of the British Empire. And I think this is also an interesting field in which this aspect of research can contribute. So there is a counter argument about seeing this not as a flow of information and educational and broadly cultural politics from the center to the periphery, but also to the extent in which we can understand the flow to the other and in the other way around. This is not just, of course, the the love for classics, the frenzy also almost for classical education and knowledge that the traveling gentlemen, as they were called at the time, developed. But it's also the fact that there was many of these encounters that advanced cultural knowledge and education to some certain extent in the heart of the empire as well. So when I was studying about looking at the sources about the Ionian Islands, I understood that this was much broader than, of course, the Ionian Academy and the 1820s. There had to be a chapter, so to speak, on education in the Ionian state from the beginning and up until, let's say, at least towards the end of the period of the British protectorate. I must say that there's only one book in Greek, actually, by Nikos Kourkoumelis on education in Corfu, and not all in all islands under British protection, of course. But this was a starting point of trying to see how a school system educated a new generation of future politicians, lawyers, public opinion merchants, public opinion makers, merchants, and civil servants that formed the core and the cadre of the reformist movement, which extended, of course, beyond the walls of the Ionian Assembly. And that was, of course, as I said, a chapter in a much broader study. Yet there is a lot to be said about how the British interacted or shaped, rather, educational and to a certain extent cultural policy and cultural politics in the Ionian Islands. In the bicentennial occasion, I think I'm not going to say much about the history and historiography of the Greek Revolution, but I think it's important to note that all this takes place today at a moment when there is, for some time now, an imperial turn in the history of the Greek Revolution. And I think the talks or the intervention later on after my talk will be another example. I'm just giving you here a few points about what the sort of historical context of the period we're talking about, of the opening of this institution of knowledge in Corfu took place. And it is, as I said, interesting that this comes at a time when I think a quite mature time, so to speak, moment of Greek historiography that now sees the Greek Revolution not just as a sort of international event, but much more specifically as with empire as a category, as an analytical category in the history of the empire. Lord Guilford or Frederick North, as he was born, he's an extremely interesting character, and I think if it wasn't for his untimely death in 1827, I think he would have been granted even much more claim and fame because of his achievements. Very interesting character. I'm not going to go into many biographical details because I think that's, that can be easily found. I'll just note a couple of more that I think are important. He's, this is the area, of course, we're talking about in the 19th century. This is from the 1850s, Greece and the Ionian Republic. Also, it's always important to know that this is a very republican tradition that remains, of course, under the protection of the British, of his and then later Her Majesty, but it's still for the Ionian Islands. This is a republic, and that always creates, several tensions, not least in the claims that Ionians put forward towards the British. Among the many biographical details of Frederick North, what I think is important is that his first visit to Corfu, he was baptized as a Greek Orthodox. In the case of his connections, he was corresponding with Capodistria, and while he was still at an early age, and it seems that some of the ideas that germinated about producing an institution of higher education were popular in both Capodistria's and Guilford's correspondence. So there is some evidence that shows how they were developed these, so how they were aware of educational projects and ideas with each other. And Capodistria, of course, took a completely different career turn, but it's important to note that in his early days as a politician, in his 20s actually, as a minister of the Ionian Islands Septinsular Republic, we tend to call it as the first Greek state. I think it's important to know that this is the first Ionian state as well, because not least because it wasn't obvious as sort of early as the early 18th, 19th century that the Ionian Islands would form a sort of united state entity. If you read the Times, for instance, of 1802, you will read about Zante ready to secede from Corfu and break away from Corfu. So you can only imagine the sort of Ionian civil war brewing there. And it was people like, not to mention the fractions and the conflicts in Kefalonia, of course, that Capodistria personally intervened and to a certain extent diffused. So, the young Capodistria should also be credited for these ideas that he exchanged with Guilford about an institution of higher education. The moment of the Ionian Academy in 1823 to 1824 officially comes also at a time when the Greek War of Independence rages on across the Ionian Sea, as I said earlier. And this should also be kept in mind, not least because it shaped the decisions about the Ionian University, the Ionian Academy, and personally the decisions that Lord Guilford was allowed or not to make. The opening of the university comes also at a time, at a moment of transition in a colonial administration of the Ionian Islands from the first High Commissioner and commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, Thomas Maitland, to the man you see on the statue here in front of the palace that his predecessor built, Thomas Maitland. This is Frederick Adam, who was the second in command while Maitland was commissioner, and he took over from him as commissioner in 1824, shortly after Maitland's death. This is also a moment when not just Corfu, but the Ionian Islands are experiencing probably the period of very large development in their capacities of infrastructure, educational. The Ionian Academy is one example, but also social and political as well. There is a moment of transition, not just in colonial administration, but also from the transition from the sort of older generation to the new one that is not yet taken over. But Frederick Adam definitely a reformer in many ways, or at least facilitating many of the changes that people like Napier were allowed to implement. And this is it's a different island, Kefalonia, but his achievements, not least in in the roads and the infrastructure that are built, allow us to understand much better how many worlds apart the Ionian Islands are from the revolution and war-ravaged Peloponnese, Sterea, and the Aegean Islands. So this is a contrast that I would like people to keep in mind. I must say it wasn't in discussions about the sort of the 200 years revolution. It hasn't been brought up as much, but I think it's really important to understand how different Greek worlds there are at the time and how they overlap or intersect at the moments and the years that the revolution lasted. The other interesting thing I find about Frederick North is that I call him a sort of a reluctant colonial administrator. He served also as the governor of Ceylon or Sri Lanka. Of course, he had spent a brief time in Corsica, but it's his journeys to the Ottoman Empire that really informed him as an intellectual and as an educational reformer, we could say. In 1817, he also is a reluctant colonial administrator because he's under the shadow, so to speak, I guess, of his uncle, also namesake Frederick North, who served as the prime minister during the War of Independence in the American Revolution. So, great statesman, Frederick North, his uncle Frederick North, but in 1817, after his older brother passed, he becomes the Earl of Guilford, and that ensures that he has the financial ability to implement the educational projects that he has developed the years before. He also has, not least through his uncle, family networks. He was also Lord Beaufort's cousin, and this commitment, but also the connections, I suppose, managed to override the first commissioner of the Ionian Island Metland's reluctance to grant the university to Ionians for fear of stimulating anti-British sentiment and Greek nationalism. So Metland, he was probably right in that too, as he was right in many other things, in his sort of forceful and very dominating manner of governing. Metland is also to blame for the decision not to seat the university in Ithaca, which was the original plan. And it seems that from the relevant evidence that Guilford insisted on having the university in Ithaca, but it was for reasons of security that Metland decided, and the British more generally decided not to have the university in Ithaca, sort of an isolated campus on a small island that was with a great heritage, of course, with a great past. That was the whole project of the Ionian Academy, but it was decided that the university would not have its seat would not be based in Ithaca. Of course, there is no evidence that Ithaca was under threat at any point during the war of the Revolutionary War, but nonetheless, it is interesting that the war in the mainland Greece decided, so to speak, the decision to have the university in Corfu. I must say there were probably other practical considerations. There was also, buildings that could house the university, and Corfu was the capital of the state, so it would all make financial sense as well to have the university in Corfu and not in very charming but kind of isolated Ithaca in the 1820s. In March 1820, after Metland, that Guilford knows very well, succeeded in Ceylon, Guilford also arrived in Corfu to take over as Archon of Education, so Lord of Education. And this is something that I think people should remember, that this is not just an initiative that Guilford comes to Corfu, sort of sets up his plan to start a university. Guilford had a comprehensive plan, a 70-page project on education on all levels of education, so primary, secondary, and higher education. The Lancastrian method of teaching is at the center of the reforms proposed. This is not unusual, and it was probably not the first time that it was proposed in the Ionian Islands. There is some debate about that, who was the first. But as I mentioned, the plans of Guilford were taken into consideration only to a certain extent. What is interesting, that at the time that Guilford developed his plan, Metland passed away, and the appointment of his second command, Adam, as commissioner, who was also married to Palatianou Corfiot, a lady, meant that the plan to open the university went ahead. So Adam was more sympathetic to the idea of supporting Guilford in promoting his plan for a university. There's also, however, a story that has to be told here about the origins of these cultural and educational initiatives from the early 19th or even the 18th century, and there are the well-known academias of Italian South, especially that appear in the Ionian Islands already since the 17th and 18th century in different forms. But what really stands out is what became the Ionian Academy of 1808. Completely by Ionians themselves, of which two people should be mentioned. Here is Stylianos Vlasopoulos, great politician, administrator, and intellectual of the Ionian Islands in the late 18th, early 19th century. The development of public health before, but also during the Septinsular Republic and the French occupation period. We have the professionalization of medicine, for instance, that the French promote very heavily also for military reasons in the period 1807, 1814. But I think this is the background to what becomes the Faculty of Medicine in the Ionian Academy in 1824. It doesn't last very long, but outcomes should not make us lose the meaning of the original intentions and of plans and initiatives that went ahead even only for a little while. There are also two, I think, programmatic documents that explain the founding of what we can call Ionian University. The first is Capodicia's memorandum to Castlereagh in 1815 that includes many of the educational issues that are at stake for people like Capodicias and Guilford. And Guilford's memorandum that I mentioned following his report to the Ionian Senate in 1821 after touring the islands to inspect schools as Archon of Education. So what I'm saying is that this is a very well concerted effort. It does not sort of come up as a sort of, Guilford's own initiative and sometimes pictured as a sort of romantic idea because of the way he and the first students and professors of the academy were dressed, for example, going around the city in tunics, sort of romanticizing or folklorizing, if you like, the opening of the academy. And it's, true, many people probably thought they were quite strange at the time, but, from point of view, though, of the educational policies that Guilford represented, they were very concerted and quite detailed. In 1824, in May, is the official opening of the Ionian Academy in May 1824, with 4 faculties: theology, law, medicine, and philosophy, which includes departments of science and philology. There is an intake of students, just a few in 1824, but quickly by 1826 has more than 200 students, 16 professors, some educated in Europe with expenses paid by Guilford. And you can see the sort of federal nature of the student body. From Corfu, most of them, predictably. Kefalonia, Ithaca has 21, interestingly. And from the continent of Greece, as one source from 1827 calls it, 63. And you can see that already in its first or second year of operation, the University Academy already attracts people from mainland Greece. What is also interesting in the educational reform that Guilford put forward, that the FEV, the University Preparatory School, has 500 students. So this is sort of a level of education that Guilford and later on Mustoxidi, as also Lord of Education, implemented to have, and High Commissioners accepted to have as a preparatory school. So not go for the sort of allelodidactica scholia, the Lancastrian method schools, straight to the university. What is also very important to note is that Guilford's personal project is not just to have a school that is made in a sort of ad hoc manner, but it was also his personal project to collect and seek the endowment of the library with thousands of books, which is pretty impressive at the time. You don't have only universities such as Oxford and Cambridge that Guilford sought to get the resources, some of the resources from, but also the King of Denmark, Count Mocenigo, the Russia's man on the ground, so to speak, in the early 19th century, offered his collection of about 1,000 books. The East India Company, interestingly, some other connections perhaps of Lord Guilford himself, and of course his own collection of 8,000 printed works and 3,000 manuscripts. And by 1827, one source mentions of more than 21,000 books, perhaps with some exaggeration. This is an example, I think, of a university that had it benefited from a longer lifespan of its founder and visionary. It would have made a mark on not just on sort of the educational affairs of the Ionian Islands, but also of Greece as a whole. I think it would have been extremely interesting to have two models of higher education, one in Athens that would come that would result from a Greek state with its sort of nationalist and early nationalist and sort of classical focus, but also on the Ionian Islands with its much more I would say even research focused and oriented on language, philosophy, law, medicine, and down the road engineering, another school that opened in the 1840s. So the university is, in more than one sense, pioneering. It has no tuition fees, interestingly, and attracted students from many Ionian Islands and Ottoman Greeks. It is interesting to note this because it raises the question of how sustainable was that. And after, it is not accidental that after Lord Guilford's death in 1827, the university fell into decline, partly because of the lack of resources. And it sort of lingered on until 1864, and then it closed. The Greek state considered it impossible to maintain two universities, and this was sort of the excuse or the actual financial reason for the university to close. Guilford, it seems, sought to break away from higher education tradition of Ionians who were studying in Italian universities. This was the sort of tradition at the time, and that seems to have had limited success, although the law school was particularly successful in the respect that by 1840s, there are British accounts that speak of the countless young Ionians who studied law and have nothing else to do, just linger on in Corfu streets. But in many ways, his other ambition to intervene in Greek affairs more broadly was also checked by his early and untimely death. So what happens after he died is that, first of all, it set a volatile course for the rest of the university's lifespan until, of course, 1985 and its resurrection as the Ionian University, if we want to sort of establish a continuity there. But in October 1827, merely 6 days before the Battle of Navarino, Lord Guilford's death led to the return of his books, or most of his books, to his heirs in England. It's the university, the academy, saw its budget reduced significantly, and therefore curtailed opportunities to the instruction offered. In the following decades, though, there is, under Commissioner Douglas, also important for many reforms, a revival of the university, but also a shift towards an Italianization of the academy. So we have the arrival of 5 Italian professors, and the formation of a sort of Italian versus a Greek team of professors there, where with Italian becoming a language of instruction, both against Guilford's original intention, of course, but also against the constitutional charter's education and sort of overall logic about Greek becoming the language of administration. That was never the case, at least not until the 1840s or even 1850s in some respects. And the Ionian Academy was also part of this sort of regression, if you like, to the sort of Italian becoming the dominant for practical reasons mostly, but also ideological to a certain extent, for some people becoming the language of instruction. At the same time, the university was also, the academy, if you like, was also the pioneering in promoting a certain new culture of public service. So there was a civil service oath that was practiced at the time, the open public exams, pioneered by Professor of Mathematics Karandinos, one of the founders of Greek mathematics in the modern age, obviously. And there is a significant trajectory between those aspects of the Ionian Academy and sort of the public sphere more broadly. I think, again, had it been allowed to flourish and to have been properly funded as well, it would probably make an even more important mark than it did in the 1820s and maybe 1830s. In the 19th century, and I know, we mentioned historiography towards at the beginning, but I want us I want you to think a little bit about how this has been historically determined as well. So you have the 19th century accounts of the Ionian Academy. So Tipaldos Iakovatos, a very fiery politician of the Ionian Islands as well. Papadopoulos Vretos, sort of the librarian of the Ionian Academy who actually wrote about it. Chiotis and Verikios a little bit later in the sort of mid to late 19th century. They shaped their view on Guilford partly because of his lukewarm or probably even outright negative response to the outbreak of the revolution. It seems that Guilford thought it was premature and challenged sort of the rightful government, the Sultan at the time. So he was a little bit like Korais in that respect. But I wouldn't say that unlike Korais, he was important because he really, went and created an institution he dreamed about. So he didn't stay sort of abroad, let's say. Historians more recently, Henderson, Angelomati Tsugaraki, and Astrachas to a certain extent, have identified what were important in the creation of the Ionian Academy. I don't have time to go into those issues here, but I just want to say one of the most important, that seems to be one of the most thorny issues, seems to be, again, the language of instruction, which goes at the heart, of course, of all the debates about what is going to be the language of the nation. And we have, of course, the work of Konstantin Azanu, above all that, is looking at these particular aspects of identity, of Ionian identity, sort of in the middle, or bridging, if you like, Italian and Greek identities in the 19th century. Guilford's intentions, therefore, and ambitions were cut abruptly because of his death, but they were also a challenge brought in by the outbreak of the revolution and the sheer fact that it went on for so long. So over time, it seems that this becomes a secondary issue to Adams' administration. This is a lot to look into from the point of view of the British governor. But I would say over time, the institution fell into some sort of decline because the British and the Ionian administration, the resources they had, even with Mustoxidi as Archon of Education much later on in the 1850s, they seem to be focusing on primary education first. And that makes sense. This is a sort of a really stretched out system over several islands that, of course, they have the local governments as states or small states, of course, but Corfu attracting most of the resources, but it is still a sort of federal-like system. Therefore, in the later decades, there was an impact of sort of British cultural expansion, most evident in the Lancastrian system of teaching and organization. Also, I would say again that Guilford had an overall plan for education in all islands and in all levels of education, public education as well. But it was like in so many other aspects and spheres of the Ionian state, it was applied by Ionians and it was funded by Ionian state resources. I think also it has to be said that the name of the institution that prevailed, the Ionian Academy, it provided legitimacy as it's established continuities both with ancient Greek forms of learning, of course, and knowledge, but also with the recent Ionian and Corfu past. I think this is important to note, as there were this overall a constellation of achievements in education, science, data management, even by Ionians themselves, a milieu that was very conducive to the Ionian Academy that Guilford imagined and created. Also, I would just like to close by saying that Guilford has mostly been acknowledged, I think, at a local level in Corfu. I think this opportunity allows us to, spread the word a little bit more, and I hope definitely that it's going to occupy researchers' projects in the future, as it's definitely worth it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Saki, for this wonderfully rich and wide-spanning presentation situating the Lord Guilford as well as his educational work in multiple contexts, the metropolitan, the colonial, the Ionian, and the Mediterranean, and kind of highlighting the new connections, the new channels that the very establishment of the Academy actually facilitated. We turned from the British to the Russians while remaining in Corfu. Just a last note, it was actually very refreshing to note that there was a time where a British institution would actually not charge international or let's say non-British students with tuition fees. And so there is some hope for the future in the past. So we turn to Professor Lucien Frary from Rider University, New Jersey, an expert in Russian history of the 19th century with important work on Russia and the Greek world over the course of the 19th century. Professor Frary has very kindly agreed to join us tonight from New Jersey. And he will be talking about Russophilia in the Ionian Islands and the coming of the Greek Revolution. Professor Frary, it's wonderful to have you with us. He is, I think, there he is, I hope. Okay, there seems to be a connectivity issue. So let's wait for a few more seconds, and if not, I think we'll seek assistance from the other end of the Mediterranean. Okay, I think while waiting for Lucien to probably log back in, we will be turning to Dr. Chrysovalantis Kyriacou from the Bank of Cyprus Cultural Foundation. Chrysovalantis holds a PhD from Royal Holloway, so it's wonderful to virtually welcome you back, Chrysovalantis, with important work on the Cyprus in during the period of Latin rule. Chrysovalantis will talk to us today about the Cypriots in and their role during the Greek Revolution of 1821. Chrysovalantis, thank you so much for agreeing to join us tonight.
Thank you very much, Barry. I hope you can hear me and that you can see my screen.
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. My title is The Cypriots in the Greek Revolution of 1821. The official Ottoman Defter register on the Turkish massacres of July 1821 in Cyprus lists 96 proscribed and 74 executed Cypriot notables, while 22 are mentioned to have escaped. A modest estimation for the number of Cypriot volunteers fighting in the Greek Revolution is around 500. The island's overall population in the 1820s, including Muslims, women, children, and the elderly, is estimated between 40 to 50,000, which means that among every 100 Cypriots, at least one fought in the revolution. Any exploration of the Cypriot contribution to the Greek Revolution of 1821 should begin by describing the contacts between Archbishop Kyprianos, 1810 to 1821, and the Philhellene, continuing with the hecatomb of Orthodox prelates and notables orchestrated by the Muhasil, the governor, in July 1821, moving on to the participation of Cypriot volunteers in the theatres of war, and ending with the Cypriot appeal to Ioannis Kapodistrias in 1828 that the island will be part of the free Greek state. The aim of this brief intervention is not to provide an exhaustive presentation of the subject. Anyone interested in a chronological narrative of the events should consult some of the best works on Cyprus in 1821, including those by Georgios Kipiadis, Emmanuel Prodopsaltis, Paschalis Kitromilidis, and Kostis Kokinoftas. Instead, I would like to share with you some thoughts on the way ideological developments led the Cypriots, who were relatively isolated from the Greek mainland and had no military or naval tradition, to be involved in the Greek Revolution. In other words, how did ideology influence the thoughts, actions, and expectations of Cypriot groups and individuals before and after 1821? To answer this question, we need to place Cyprus within a broader Mediterranean context, focusing on three aspects. First, the Orthodox cultural revival on the island in the 18th and 19th centuries. Second, Cypriot diasporic networks. And third, the way empires shaped the multiple identities of our Cypriot historical actors. The second half of the 18th and the early 19th century witnessed a remarkable cultural revival, with Archbishops Philotheos, Chrysanthos, and Kyprianos founding Hellenic schools, collaborating with distinguished scholars, and sponsoring the printing in Venice of liturgical, hagiographical, canonical, philosophical, and historical works. Cypriot Philomathia became a channel for the contact of Orthodox ecclesiastics and laypersons with the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment. The role of Archbishop Kyprianos, who had been educated in Bucharest and Jassy, was crucial. His founding of the Hellenic School of Nicosia in 1812 intended to transform the youth into pious, sensible, civil, upright, just, patriotic, and friendly to commerce men, άνδρες θεοσεβείς, φρόνιμοι, πολιτικοί, χριστοήθεις, δίκαιοι, φιλοπάτριδες, φιλέμποροι. Although the echo of the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment among the Cypriots was limited, reaching only the circles of merchants and scholars, it enabled the gradual nationalization of the local Orthodox identity. Radicalized merchants and scholars like the companion of Rigas Fereos, Ioannis Karantζas, Nikolaos Thysseus, his brother, and Archimandrite Theophylactos Thysseus, and Ioannis Stavrianos took revolutionary action against the Ottomans because of their liberal political ideas. What needs to be stressed, however, is that these ideas were inseparable from the dominantly religious nature of the revolution, which took the form of and was perceived as a struggle of Christianity against Islam. Most of the Cypriot volunteers fighting in Greece seem to have been peasants whose perception of national freedom was probably highlighted intensely by their Orthodox faith. Mobility and diasporic networks were the mechanisms for the transmission of liberal ideas and the undertaking of revolutionary action. Although the exact number of Cypriots in the Philiki area is unknown, the Athanasios Sekeris and Ioannis Philemon registers in the of the Eteria's members list only one, the teacher Charalambis Malis, who had been recruited by Grigorios Dikeos Papaflessas. Malis was in contact with Nikolaos Thysseus in Marseille and later fought in Greece. In 1825, he visited, representing the Greek revolutionary government, the Libanese emir Bashir Shihab II, attempting, ultimately with no success, to forge an alliance with him and coordinate an anti-Ottoman attack. Following the massacres of July 1821, waves of pro-revolutionary Cypriot refugees migrated to Greece, much like the refugees from Kydonie and Smyrna, with whom they fought in the Ionic phalanx. They must have sought protection, revenge, and a better future after the destruction of their homeland. Others reached the ports of Marseille, Livorno, Ancona, Genoa, Venice, and Trieste. Some, like Christos David from Limassol, who was related to Archbishop Kyprianos, ended up in Alexandria, where he sold oxen to Muhammad Ali Pasha. A young lady named Pezouna, namely Peristera, Harta, was established in Venice with the surviving members of her family and married in 1826 the courtier scholar Andreas Mustoxidis. Both were active in relieving Greek refugees. Ioannikios, the exarch of the Cypriot archbishopric, managed to secure financial support for the impoverished Cypriots in Marseille from King Louis XVIII of France. Ioannikios' network of contacts in Paris included the powerful Ottoman Pashas Mustafa Reshid and Fethi Ahmed. The exarch's two Ottoman patrons facilitated his rise to the office of archbishop between 1840 and 1849. On 6 December 1821, a group of refugee ecclesiastics, including Ioannikios and laymen, signed, probably in Marseille, a declaration of liberation from Turkish tyranny. The Cypriot Revolutionary Committee appointed Nikolaos Thisevs as their representative for securing a loan from the Christian monarchs of Europe and for organizing a military force to fight in Greece and Cyprus. Despite negotiations with philhellenic circles in London, these plans remained unfulfilled. Nikolaos Thisevs, a relative of Archbishop Kyprianos, used his trading office in Marseille as a recruitment base for French and Italian philhellenes traveling to Greece, as well as for the gathering of supplies for the revolutionaries. Nikolaos himself fought under the command of Theodoros Kolokotronis, while his brother, Archimandrite Theophylactos, lost a hand in Missolonghi and was promoted to vice general in 1825. In March 1826, Nikolaos approached the British government through the mediation of the former army officer and scholar William Martin Leake, proposing that Cyprus will become a British protectorate like the Ionians. The British would eventually replace the Ottomans as rulers of Cyprus in 1878. It becomes clear that the Cypriots knew how to move across empires. This was because they had been living in and between empires for centuries. Their historical experiences had taught them how to develop multiple identities, which they employed in response to particular circumstances. We have already seen the case of the exarch Ioannikios, who acted both as a Greek revolutionary and an Ottoman Christian ecclesiastic. During the Napoleonic Wars, Russian and French involvement in Ottoman affairs created different groups and tendencies among the Cypriots. In 1804, the unpopular taxation and pro-Russian sympathies of the powerful dragoman, court interpreter of Cyprus, Hagi Georgakis Kornesios, led to his downfall and execution in 1809, as well as to Archbishop Chrysanthos' exile. Kyprianos, the new archbishop, 1810, had been educated in the pro-French Phanariot environment of Molto-Wallachia. His rise coincided with the alliance between France and the Ottoman Empire in 1807. Parenthetically, the Kefalonian merchant Konstantinos Peristianis, a Freemason who served as Russian consul in Larnaca and was known for his anti-Ottoman ideology, collaborated with both Hagi Georgakis and Kyprianos. This indicates the complexities posed by different imperial loyalties and sympathies. Being a patriot, Kyprianos was in contact with the Philikieteria and wished to see Cyprus, his homeland, experience a revival. After the revolution's outbreak, Kyprianos, acting as a sensible pastor and a loyal ecclesiastic in Ottoman service, ordered his Christian flock to surrender their weapons and remain obedient and non-provocative. Standing before the gallows on 9 July 1821, the Archbishop chose to die as a Christian rather than live as a Muslim. Not all Cypriot Christians were willing to die for their faith. Some escaped, as we have seen, abandoning the island. Others stayed and were forced or chose to embrace Islam. Many practiced Christianity in secret. Among these crypto-Christians were the notables Andreas Solomonidis or Khurshid Aga and his brother Marcos or Ahmed Aga. In 1828, Khurshid Aga signed the Cypriot petition to Capodistrias for the island's liberation. He also addressed the governor in a personal letter, stating that although his body and name were different, he remained Christian in his heart. Despite his personal tragedy, Solomonidis is reported to have behaved tyrannically since he persecuted his fellow Christians in order to seize their property. I hope that my attempt to cover in brief the Cypriot contribution to the Greek Revolution has made clear that there is no single narrative concerning the complex relationship between identity and ideology. The national idea was slowly born within an Orthodox Cypriot cultural matrix under the influence of the Enlightenment. Cypriot diasporic networks enhanced the diffusion of revolutionary ideas in different forms and ways. The shifting realities of imperial experience could lead to a variety of responses and identities. Our Cypriot historical actors lived in the same turbulent times, but perceived and expressed their patriotism differently. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chrysovalantis, for a very interesting intervention and also for saving the day. It is great to see certain connections already being forming, that is between the Ionians operating or being active in Cyprus, as and vice versa, engaging into all sorts of kinship or commercial ties, plus the Russians coming in as some sort of a cross-Mediterranean or trans-Mediterranean glue. So the floor is now yours, Lucien. Thanks a lot for rejoining us. And we look forward to hearing more about Russophilia, this time in the Ionian Islands, and the coming of the Greek Revolution.
Excellent. Can you hear me now, Paris? Thank you so much to the university, to Royal Holloway University London, and to all of you who are sharing your attention today with this conference. Thank you to Professor Clogg for coming up with the idea. Excuse me for the technological problem. My office at the university is currently going through an electronic restart, so that I have no power, and I've been in between computers. But I'm really happy to be here. I'm really delighted to share with you some thoughts. And before we started today, I realized also that I had some difficulty sharing my PowerPoint. So I'm going to ask Paris to share your screen, and I'm going to somewhat awkwardly follow along on my computer, and hopefully this will work out. So thank you very much for your patience. What I really enjoyed this opportunity to do is to develop a project that's been in the back of my mind for some years, dealing with the Ionian Islands and their role in the coming of the Greek Revolution. And my particular angle, of course, will be dealing with Russian context. So Paris, can you turn it to the first slide? I don't think that's the first slide. The first one starts with the title, correct. And I thought that it would be appropriate to begin my Ionian dream, this project called Russophilia, if I ever get a chance to write a larger project about it, to share some ideas about primary sources. The Vlachoyannis collection at the General State Archives in Athens is absolutely rich with material regarding this project. Of course, there are two major archives in Moscow, which also deal with Russian contacts in the Mediterranean during this epoch. And we can also back up this material with newspaper reports and from the reports of people involved on the ground at that point. So Paris, if you can move to the next slide. So this project is one aspect of a larger research agenda dealing with Russian-Greek relations in the post-Byzantine era, a sort of exotic disease that I have had for a couple of decades now. And what I'm going to do then is focus in a little bit more on Russian contacts in the late 18th century and early 19th century, particularly in the Ionian Islands. And my general main point is that Russia's role in this region is really pivotal in the outbreak of the Revolution of 1821. So Paris, if you could go to the next slide, please. Now, our narrative can conveniently begin with the Russian arrival in the Mediterranean during Catherine the Great's first archipelago expedition, which coincided, of course, with the Russian-Turkish War of 1768-1774. Recently, there is this massive tome by a number of scholars led by Elena Smilyanskaya on Russia in the Mediterranean, which details this expedition. And the general idea is that these two Russian squadrons arrive in the Mediterranean, and they begin to make contact in Malta, in various cities along the Italian Boot, and of course on the Ionian Islands as they're venturing towards the Eastern Mediterranean to have a showdown with the Ottoman Sultan. But as these ships are sailing off the coast, they are beginning to make contact with Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians. Now, when the squadron reaches the Ionian Islands, they begin to take on volunteers who are then given Russian commissions, enter into the Russian military or into the Russian Navy. And then during the course of the fighting, they participate, of course, in the Orlov Rebellion in the Morea. In Russia's governance of the Archipelago Republic during the early 1770s. When the war is over with the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kanyarji in 1774, many of these individuals are now no longer able to return back to their homes, either in the Ionian Islands or other regions of Greece, which are now Ottoman. So they begin to migrate to Russia, and they form colonies, especially in the south, in what is today Moldova, but also in areas along the Black Sea coast. So Paris, if you could go to the next slide, please. And an important element of this military involvement in the Mediterranean is the establishment after the Kuchuk-Kanyarji Treaty of Russian consulates. And I have a list at the bottom of the slide of various posts which open up at this time. And everything doesn't occur, of course, at the same time as the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kanyarji, but the main point is that the consuls are of Greek extraction. And here we begin to see Russia building up then not only political contacts in this area, and also but military ones. And with the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kanyarji, we begin to see economic contacts also begin to flourish. In the Second War of Catherine against the Ottoman Empire, we'll see that more Greeks get involved. And of course, the activity of Lambros Katsonis is very famous. And he, of course, has victory after a victory against the Ottomans in that war of 1787 to 1792. So the basic idea then is that by the end of the 18th century, Russia has had several decades of military contacts, of consular contacts, and of economic contacts, and they begin to build up a real large personnel. And many of these people have relatives who are living in Black Sea Russia, which is now part of the empire, Crimea, and so on. So Paris, if you could go to the next slide, please. But the central portion really of this report deals with the Ushakov expedition, the third great Russian expedition to the Mediterranean during these years, and how that affects the Ionian Islands. And this works really perfectly with Sakis's report that we heard earlier. So the general idea, of course, is this is about the War of the Second Coalition. The French take over the Ionian Islands with the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. And the Russians are planning an advance into Central Europe, and they try to provide a sort of a southern support for Suvorov's attack in Central Europe by taking control of these strategically placed Ionian Islands. And the fleet led by Ushakov, who is of course one of Russia's most recognized admirals, begins to make contacts on the islands and enlist more of these Greeks that we have already seen join in the earlier Russian expeditions to the Mediterranean. And the people who are now involved come from areas with really interesting military traditions. Klefts, armatoli, mercenaries, pirates, individuals who have got already quite a bit of military experience. So they see opportunities here. And hundreds of people join the Russian flotilla, and then they begin to attack with the support of the Ottomans, because of course the Russians and the Ottomans have an agreement in 1799. They begin to take on island by island, and there are some really tremendous battles for Zakynthos, Kefalonia, Lefkada, and the central contest takes place on Corfu because of the great fortress there. There's a siege which lasts several months, but eventually the Russians prevail, principally with Greek support. But there's an interesting angle here, which I'd like to develop further with memoirs and archival materials, that there's really an overlapping here between popular uprisings by these Greek Christians and also the military activity of the Russians. So again, we're in a situation where after the Russians take control of the Ionian Islands, we've got these individuals who have contacts back in the Russian Empire, and then more colonies. Then this military diaspora begins to form in the Black Sea. What is Alexander doing? What is the Tsar doing? Well, he, of course, takes the throne in 1801. He's not interested really in having Ushakov remain in those areas. But he begins to think, really dream of a political experiment by some republican or constitutional government taking place in the Ionian Islands. And this it matches his peripheral plans in Finland and in Poland, and we could really consider that further. A couple of asides. In the early 1950s, the Soviets came out with not one, but two films on Ushakov. The one that you see there, the Korabli Shturmuyut, the Bastioni, is the one about the attack of Corfu. And then we needed a sequel, so we've got two movies on Ushakov. Check them out on YouTube if you care. Now you can tap a couple of slides there, Paris, because we'll see that for this seizure of Corfu, the Sultan gives Ushakov this chelenk, which no non-Muslim really receives. You'll notice too that Ushakov has now been canonized, and on the portrait that you just saw, that decoration doesn't appear. One more time, Paris. There is now also a new Russian decoration named for Ushakov. So if we go to the next slide, now we can remind ourselves too that this is at the moment when Ali Pasha is taking over regions of Epirus, and there is this great friction between areas like Preveza and Lefkada, and there's this movement of refugees, Russian, Greek-Russian veterans, Suliats begin to try to seek succor because Ali Pasha is kicking them out of their villages. And that is an interesting element here, which sort of overlaps, but for time, I'll sort of leave it as an aside. For the next slide, please. And then we can move forward to the Septinsular Republic that we just heard about. And what we're going to see is that the state becomes, of course, autonomous. We've got this wonderful educational development that we just heard about, just a really fascinating story. But then the Russians begin something like 3,000 men are in the Russian-led Ionian army. But there's this interesting friction that we heard about already before between political feuds, islanders against the Septinsular Republic. There's a social dimension in this, in this instance. But we'll see too that the Greeks perform really important diplomatic and ecclesiastical services. You'll notice that Ushakov, by the way, reestablishes the archbishopric of Corfu before he leaves in 1801. But we heard already of George Mocenigo, a really fascinating figure and the point of the spear of the Russian advance at the time. But he is the one who trains Kapodistrias. And of course, Kapodistrias' career first on the Ionian Islands, and then the Russian Empire is relatively well known. So if we move to the next slide, we can talk just real briefly about some of the secondary literature, and I'll leave off the Greek stuff for a moment, and we can just check out the main works which are in English and in Russian. You might be familiar with the work of Grigory Arsh and his really first major book in Albanian, Epirus, has been translated into Greek, and it's an extremely important source here if you're interested in Ionian and Russian context during these years. The work in blue by Stanislavskaya, Russia and Greece at the end of the 18th, early 19th century is really the best monograph on this period. But Norman Saul in English has a very useful account. And then there is this wonderful work by Nicholas Papas on the Greeks in military service, which also coincides with some of the topics that we've been dealing with. So if you advance one more slide, and I'll wrap things up. I've got about two more slides. And we'll see then these recruits begin to be utilized by the Russian state for their own purposes, but they're also great Greek patriots, and they're the leaders of the revolution of 1821. So just rapidly, Yanis Vlasopoulos comes from Ithaca. He's the Russian consul in Patras, and he's also a Philikos and a leader of the outbreak in March in Patras. Nicholas Paleologos is a Russian military agent, or a Greek-Russian military agent based in Ithaca. Antoine Sandrini is the consul sending reports back to St. Petersburg, telling us about what's going on in the Ionian Islands. You may have heard of Emmanuel Papadopoulos, who is this military commander. He has this interesting, well, he actually has a couple of publications. They're very difficult to find, but they shed light on this period. And then lastly, Russia's consul in Corfu, Papandopoulos, also reports, significantly during these years. So the last slide then deals, actually the penultimate slide, these people then, which are these Ionian Greeks, are the leaders of the Philiki Eteria, and that of course is a significant topic. And then finally, my final slide is dealing and reminding us then once again of Ushakov. And this is his memorial in Corfu. So as a sort of summary conclusion, we'll see that this Ushakov mission is really pivotal in generating the personnel which becomes the leader of the outbreak, and it's all about the Ionian Islands. It's interesting how Ypsilantis is right, and in Moldavia and Wallachia is such an important topic, but what's going on in the Morea. But here we've got the Ionians really playing an important role as well. So I really enjoyed putting together this project, and I'm very, very grateful for the chance to share some ideas about it, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lucien, for this concise and wonderfully original presentation that reintroduced to us the Russian presence in the Mediterranean from an Icelandic and specifically Ionian perspective. I have quite a few questions in mind, but I am here to serve the role of the facilitator. So I would invite the three of you to engage in a first round of comments, criticisms, or questions with each other. And focusing, I presume, in such diverse topics as the importance of islands in rethinking the Greek world of the early 19th century, the importance, of course, of empires, as well as the role of the various wars before the Greek War of Independence, that is. I don't know who would like to start. Saki, would you like to briefly somehow respond to this extra stimuli?
With pleasure, with pleasure. I would like first to say that it's important to rephrase and confirm rather the fact that, as Chrysovalantis mentioned, there is a Cypriot diaspora at the time. There is, as we already heard from Lucien, a Ionian diaspora, or even Kephalonian, if you like, an Ithaca diaspora. These are many small diasporas, or networks rather, of people. I think diaspora is kind of a misnomer here. There is a Greek diaspora a little bit later, perhaps. And as we all know, the Greek Revolution really shakes things up and perhaps generates the conditions for the emergence of a Greek diaspora, but not yet. And certainly not in the case of the Ionian Islands, which, if I may add, Lucien, there is also a military connection with all the Ionians who are in Russia already in the 18th century. Who's going to write a book at some point about Carbouri? This great Marino Carbouri is, incredibly interesting individual who advances, even science in some respect. And then he goes to his native Kefalonia to start a project on cultivating colonial crops and among other things. And then, of course, he suffers an untimely death by his own workers, because apparently he was not paying them or letting them go. So there is certainly Ionian and Russian connections that I think, Lucien very interestingly brought up. And the question about the overlap between popular uprisings and military presence, I think, is crucial to understanding the outbreak of the revolution itself. It is not just a sort of a nationalist movement, sort of an anti-Ottoman, let's say, broadly movement. There is an imperial, there is an empire on the ground there way before the Greek Revolution erupts. And lastly, for this round, let's say, I would also question or ask Lucien, to talk more about, what is the role of the Russians? This is always what puzzles me, really, really after Ushakov leaves, because he sets up this sort of the groundwork for what becomes. But then the Septinsular Republic, which has also generated a very rich collection, of sources in Corfu itself, at least in Corfu. What do the Russians do afterwards? I mean, do they really sort of have an active role to play on the ground, or is it really again run by Ionians, as seems to be the case? Because that's a sort of understanding that I have. But I would really like to hear what you say. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much to both of you for your interesting papers. I'm so sorry that Chrysovalantis, I only got to hear a second of it, and I apologize so much for technical details. In response to your question, Sakis, it's really about Tsar Alexander's overall policy objectives. And the Septinsular Republic, I will argue, it coincides with his more experimental and enlightened early years. He's open to Republican ideas. He's willing to, dream of constitutions, and this experimentation takes place in the periphery of the empire, and he has ideas about somehow implementing it in the Russian Empire as well. There's constitutional plans in Russia in the early 1800s. But then the clash with Napoleon really changes things, and the Russian position after the Septinsular Republic or in the Ionian Islands is one of diplomacy primarily, and they have intense negotiations with Ali Pasha. There is a great outreach to take refugees, families from the region, and plant them in the Black Sea. So we'll see ambassadorial reports from Constantinople with petitions from Greeks pleading for the Tsar's help. Thousands of families, if I believe the sources, are involved, and the Russian Empire makes a clear effort to provide funds to these people and to provide the paperwork so that they can get through the Ottoman checkpoints and then reach their homeland. Something else that we should be reminded of that makes this more complicated is that a Russian-Ottoman war breaks out in 1806. So that makes Russian naval contacts in that area much more difficult, but it's a part of the story. So this is something, of course, that I'd like to explore much more fully, and I would love to check out the archives in Corfu as well. And then I just have one brief point. Chrysovalantis, I've been just waiting to hear your report. I'm so fascinated on the Cypriot role, and I think it's really neglected. And right when I was able to click in, I heard something about Peristianis, who is the Russian consul there, and I've been following his work, and he reports to Constantinople as well. And there's a great, a series of files in Moscow from him, but I just haven't had the time to sort of systematically work them through. I think he's based in Larnaca in like 1812, and he's there into whatever the 1820s, and then he sort of disappears. But these become family affairs, so that the other Peristianis are working with the Russians. And then we can see here, you go to Cyprus today and all the advertisements are in Russian. And, it kind of comes back to this sort of area. It's interesting to make those connections. But at any rate, again, thank you.
So Valandi, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for two wonderful papers. Peristianis is a highly interesting personality, and someone has to write a book about him and his family, because his father, Evangelos Peristianis, was also acting as a pro-Russian agent in Cyprus, and there seem to have been conflicts between Evangelos Peristianis and Archbishop Chrysanthos over the limitations of Russian engagement in Eastern Mediterranean politics. Well, I am a Byzantinist working on late post-Byzantine / early modern stuff, what I find really interesting is that we have been examining the Greek Revolution either locally or nationally through the lens of post-1821 national historiography. And we need to focus more on the Greek Revolution as part of a much broader imperial context in a world that was both fragmented and interconnected through networks. This is my comment. Thank you.
Let me, I cannot resist. Let me take you from that and also from Sakis's very, I think, astute observation about diasporas. What really surprised me and also fascinated me are actually two things. A, that indeed there is actually very little point in talking about a Greek diaspora in the early 19th century. It seems to me, much more sense to talk about locality related, that is diasporas, the Cypriot, the Ionian, or indeed the Zakynthiote or the Ithacan. And then perhaps even a Mediterranean or an Ottoman diaspora, rather than, again, a Greek one. So either scaling out or scaling in order to understand what went on. The second point, and this I think, I take you here from Chrysovalantis, is again very perceptive observation that there is neither single narrative or linear kind of connection between identity and ideology. And I think all three papers have in fact questioned the singularity of ideology, the sense that there was one single understanding or way of imagining the Greek nation or the Greek self, and be one way of perceiving oneself, that is identity. So I wonder whether, given the cases you have examined, it seems to me that these people were in fact very, to a great extent, nationally indifferent. And so I wonder whether the very term identity is an obstacle, actually, in understanding their histories, rather than a heuristic device. And whether that is, we should employ other kind of concepts and tools in order to understand their trajectories. Perhaps these were not at all, these were family networks at the very end. Again, going back to Chrysovalantis' mention about Peristiani. And so I wonder what your response would be to these kind of questions of mine. Lucien, shall we start with you?
May I say something? Okay, sorry.
The floor is yours.
Oh, okay, yes, excuse me. I think your question about identity is really fascinating, especially in this borderland that we're talking over, borderlands, including Cyprus. And I like the term trans-imperial subject to consider them, but it is at precisely this moment when identities crystallize. Because we have these new questions, there may be an idea from France that arrives too about the nation, especially in a westernized area like the Ionian Islands, so that I think that this is the generation when people begin to think in broader terms that we're not just Orthodox Christians or Ottoman subjects, but rather we are Greeks. And it's at this moment that idea begins to plant itself in people's minds. And this is how we can consider the revolution too, beginning really as a local affair, maybe anti-Ottoman, maybe economic distress, maybe Russian context and Russian expectation all coinciding at once, But then it turns into a war of independence, which is really driven by this notion that we are a separate people, and it's led by individuals who are aware of different political alternatives to the Ottoman one. So I think that the question about identity is really great, and we shouldn't label people in 21st century terms in the late 18th century and early 19th century.
Thank you. Saki and Chrysovalantis.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's is becoming a very stimulating conversation. I would like also to suggest that at least, for my sort of whole approach, I wouldn't call it methodology. I prefer to see what people do and then try to extrapolate what they are. So in the sense that, Frederick North Guilford is a man on the ground, so to speak, who tries to get things through using his personal connections and family networks. Of course, people do all the time, especially if they are in the British imperial elite. I mean, that's what they do in a sense. So, but the important thing is that he achieves quite a number of important things. So what his identity was, either it was his, typical of sort of British colonial imperial network. I don't know if anyone is really, but then he's probably not. Therefore, the question that Lucien, you asked and Lucien replied very succinctly is a matter of identities, I would say, not just one, are being crystallized at around that time. But before the advent of the Russians and Ushakov and his sort of grand role personally, specifically, the French Republicans arrive in Corfu, at least. And I think this is a great Republican moment in sort of modern Greek history that, it should become even more pertinent to the discussions about the Greek Revolution that we are now having, and its sort of previous years, or a few previous years, a couple decades. Because I think the matter is not just what is not just how Greek, or in what sense Greek Ionians or Peloponnesians or Cypriots are going to become, but is this what Greekness is going to be sort of the dominant aspect. And as I said, many Ionians are, whether some were sort of pro-royalist or not, chances are they were not, definitely they were not all pro-royalist. And Republicans who are having a moment in the late 18th century, then their attempts are frustrated by the Septinsular Republic. They're not going away, but they're definitely suppressed, especially by the so-called sort of conservative constitution of 1801. Therefore, this is a moment, I think, this sort of 2 decades of, the 2 most important decades sort of in Greek history, if you like, from late 18th to sort of mid 1820s period, that are definitely force us in a way to think much more about, as I said, what kind of Greekness is emerging at the time, whether it's sort of local and regional, or is it going to be sort of a Ionian style protectorate, which is, just to remind everyone who doesn't already know this, it is a project that is very dominant in the 1825, the Act of Submission that the revolutionaries have to, or would like to get from Britain, that British declined. So there are also not just several aspects of identity that are at play at the time, but there are different even state projects that are going ahead at different level and different velocity, if you like. And of course, the Septinsular Republic and the Ionian state later on are precisely 2 examples of these different kinds of states that are not just people imagine, but actually try to build.
Thank you very much, Saki. Valanti, what is the perspective of a very early modern historian? I mean, we usually approach the Greek Revolution as part of the long 19th century, but how would things change if we saw it as part of the long 18th century? As Penelope Corfield, among others, since we have at Royal Holloway, actually suggested.
Well, the discussion on identity or identities, or the relationship between identity and networks is very interesting. I think we all agree that there are no pure identities. There are no single identities, but many layers of identity, intersected identities, which depend on particular circumstances in which we operate. Concerning the question between, on the relationship between networks and actions or identities, I find really illuminating the example of Archbishop Kyprianos. Kyprianos operated both as a Greek patriot and an Ottoman Christian official. He had the chance to save his life, to run away, to abandon the island, or he had the chance to convert to Islam and leave. He did not do so on 9 July 1821. His Orthodox identity and his duty, his sense of duty as a pastor prevailed. So he stayed and died. And this shows that networks shape identities, but they do not limit historical agency. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot to all three of you. And thanks to our viewers, our audience, for your patience. The floor is now yours. So feel free to either text your questions in the chat box or raise your virtual hand and ask our panelists. Professor Clock, if you could unmute yourself.
As you'll gather, I'm very unfamiliar with all this high tech, but I feel fortunate that I was able to participate in the celebrations in 1971 on the 150th anniversary, and also in 2021 on the 200th anniversary. And I think we've had three excellent presentations. I just like to offer a footnote to Sakis Gekas' account of the Ionian Academy and talk about the Guilford collection of books now in the British Library that had been put together by the librarian of the Ionian Academy, Andreas Papadopoulos. He published in 1845 what is in fact a kind of checklist of the books that ended up in thoroughly unsatisfactory circumstances in the British Library. I think it was just one day before Guilford died. His greedy relatives, presumably, the poor man, he was probably almost dead by then, obliged him to sign a codicil to his will, which meant that many of his books and manuscripts were sent to London to be sold because his relatives regarded him as having squandered the family fortune. And the Papadopoulos collection is an extremely interesting one. It contains about 650 books printed in Greek for a Greek readership. One of the largest collections anywhere in the world, and it's rather neglected. I myself have worked on it for the past 50, almost 60 years, but not many other people have. And Haralambos Dendrinos and I did have an idea before the pandemic developed of trying to produce a catalogue of this collection because it's a superb collection. And we were going to use a provisional cataloguing of the books. I mean, there is, of course, a British Library catalogue, but this is a much more detailed catalogue carried out by Chris Michaelidis, who was the keeper of Greek and Italian books in the British Library until his unfortunate early death. But we do hope that once the pandemic is over, which doesn't look like happening very soon, Haralambos and I hope to bring out a proper catalogue based on Chris Michaelidis' pioneering work, and possibly even digitizing the whole collection. But of course, much depends on getting funding for this work. Neither of us are bibliographers, and we want to find some sort of well-qualified Greek bibliographer to carry out the work. But it really is a superb collection and deserves to be known, and it could be a permanent contribution to our studies of Greece during the revolutionary period, and could be of great use to future generations of scholars, even those who will write papers and give lectures on the 250th anniversary. I've only done two of these anniversaries myself. Thank you.
And hopefully you'll still be around.
Well, who knows?
Thank you so very much. I think Haralambos Dendrinos has a question or a follow-up.
Just to assure Richard that we will do it. We are committed to this.
Okay.
The Hellenic Institute will do everything it can in order to publish the inventory of the catalogue of the late Chris Michaelidis, one of the kindest persons I have met in my life, in fact, and the most talented one, and very modest. I would also like to thank Richard for conceiving this and suggesting this gathering, which is very important, and also our eminent speakers, Sakis and Lucien and Chrysovalantis, and also Paris for moderating it, for coordinating, but also Achilleas Kyriacou, who behind the scenes, as always, has been helping us with organizing all this, and Catriona. I'm sure that Paris will also mention some names in the end, but I would like to change a bit the tone and ask Richard to relate to us the story you told me years ago about the two admirals of the British and Soviet fleet that met in the Mediterranean, I think.
Yes.
Yes, it is very apt to our gathering.
Yes, this was a curious thing. I think sometime in the 1790s, don't have the details with me, but the commander of the US fleet in the Black Sea was a Greek American, and the commander of the Russian Black Sea fleet was a Russian Greek. It was an extraordinary coincidence that these two Greeks of ethnic Greek heritage were circulating around the Black Sea, sort of chasing each other, and yet they were both, in the final analysis, Greeks. And I can't remember the names. I certainly have them somewhere.
I think I have found one, but he's the head, the chief of the British fleet, not the Greek American. His name is Zambellas.
Oh, yeah, but this was a different one. He wasn't in the Black Sea.
Ah, it was a different one.
Zambellas. This was a curious thing. the Royal Navy, British Navy, was once an enormous, the biggest fleet in the world. Nowadays is very much reduced, and it did have a Greek first sea lord, as we call him, but he presided over about 6 destroyers or something. No, I was thinking of two commanders of substantial fleets, the US Black Sea Fleet and the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And I just thought if they could have a kind of kafedaki together, things might get much easier in that part of the world, but I don't think it ever happened.
Or perhaps in Corfu. Mr. Buhayer, you have been waiting for quite some time now. Thank you so much.
I think I have unmuted myself, yes. My question is to Chrysovalantis specifically, if only because my book, Culture Smart Cyprus, is coming out in February, and I mention one of your own books there as must read in the further reading section. I refer specifically to what you said, that illiterate Cypriots participated in the revolution, whose background was very different to the city Cypriots, the diaspora Cypriots, the empire Cypriots. And how did these two, the illiterates who were more or less fused with perhaps the Turkish Cypriot peasantry, the diaspora, the cultured who were more interacting with perhaps a more elitist Ottoman Muslim, how did those two extremes of society find common ground to participate in the Greek Revolution?
First of all, thank you so much for mentioning my book in your book. Well, as I mentioned, the Greek Revolution very quickly took the form of religious warfare. It was Christian versus Muslim. So this polarization, this kind of religious polarization, became the vessel for mixing religion and liberal ideas and nationalism, always under the mantle of religion. And this could explain why, after the July 1821 massacres, so many Cypriot peasants, and not only peasants, we have a parallel case in Ionia in Western Asia Minor. People leaving Smyrna and Ayvalik, Kydonia to fight in Greece and die in Greece for Greece, but also having at the back of their mind that their struggle in Greece could one day liberate their own homeland. So the massacres created waves of refugees, and these refugees were motivated primarily by a religious kind of patriotism.
Thank you very much, Chrysovalantis. Thank you very much, Mr. Buhayer. Any further questions, comments, criticisms, objections, suggestions?
Can I comment on that and follow? Can I follow up from what?
Of course,
of course. Also following up from Mr. Buhayer's question. I think this is a crucial point in understanding what people are fighting for, because there are many patridas. Okay, I'll give one example of people like the ones that Lucien mentioned also in the Ionian Islands from Suli, but then there is also from Parga, who have been forcibly relocated after the town was sold to Ali Pasha in 1816-17. It took a couple of years. It was completed in 1819. So there is this transition period, and then when the revolution breaks out, all the Pargi or Parganiotes, they're trying to, or many of them, try to cross the mainland and go liberate their city, because that's what they're interested in. And of course, only gradually they are frustrated, or they are chased, or they are not allowed to return, just like many Ionians, but not all, interestingly. Of course, like the never is a sort of a whole people or whole nation rebels or tries to change the established order. So I think it's important to keep in mind that these are sort of local nuances and relates to the discussion about identities earlier. But there's certainly different reasons that people are fighting for, in different different ideals even.
Excellent point. I think it is important to keep in mind that not only were people fighting for different things, their piccola patria, right, their hometown, but that the future seemed wide open. Not only because their horizons had widened, but because so many places in the periphery, so to speak, of the Greek-speaking Greek Orthodox world, from the Ionian Islands to Cyprus, were becoming virtually laboratories of state-building experimentation, new ways of imagining one's identity, bridgeheads of new ideologies arriving, but also old ones persisting, the Venetian legacy that Saki, you referred to. And therefore, this ability to choose and navigate new dangers, but also fascinating kind of currents, since we're talking about maritime empires and islands, makes, I think, offers the historian a much more interesting landscape to navigate himself or herself. And it appears that the Greek state was one of the many options, one that prevailed at the end, but that was not the safest of bets, probably.
So if I may continue follow up, I think that it is definitely one option, but it is not sort of a sense of repertoire of state types that people can choose and pick. I think once the revolution breaks out and those who are in it, they don't really have much option of going sort of trying to especially after 1825, 26, it really becomes clear that for many of them, and that's how I think they turn things around to a certain extent, they will really, die or sort of, become more independent. On the contrary, Ionians, who don't rebel against the British protectorate, okay, there's a couple of uprisings, but they never really challenged seriously, the British sort of force on the island, especially in Corfu. For them, the option really becomes to reform the state. So I think that's what's interesting. So depending on the conditions that people find themselves in, which they didn't choose necessarily, they try to make sort of they make different choices.
True, sure. I think that's a good end point, unless Lucien would like to step in.
I would like to
Sure.
make one small question about Papadopoulos Vretos. This catalog is unavailable online. We can't find the collection anywhere. This is correct. And is his first name Emmanuel? Because there's a Papadopoulos Vretos who travels to St. Petersburg often, and who is close to Galitzin, who is the minister of religion at the time, who is close, of course, to Kapodistrias. And he's an important figure in church affairs in Russia. He apparently shares an icon that is painted by Luke, which is from Cyprus, with the Tsar, and also a portion of the Holy Cross to Russia, and other sort of interesting relics that he brings from the Eastern Mediterranean to Russia. And then later on, he also publishes works during the Crimean War, which are which are pro-Russia. And they're in French, and I think he's based in Paris at the time. But is this the same Papadopoulos Vretos? It must be an important family, and perhaps there's more than one of these figures. Is his name Emmanuel? That's okay. To know of the collection is enough. I'll be able to dig around, but that is a really a great link.
I just wanted to say that the Papalopoulos I was talking about, who had been librarian of the Ionian Academy, was Andreas Papalopoulos. What was your Papalopoulos, so to speak?
I think his name is Emmanuel, but
they're probably
I'll have to look into it. So yours is Andreas.
Yes, I'm only familiar with him as Guilford's librarian. It's a very useful book.
Yeah, thank you.
It's the only kind of effort to create a kind of checklist of this superb collection in the British Library.
I think it's very fitting that we end up with Richard Clark's observation. Thank you again, Richard, for coming up with this wonderful idea and for engaging all of us in a fascinating almost 2-hour-long discussion. Saki, thank you very much for a wonderfully insightful and colorful lecture that inserted Lord Guilford to the different worlds he inhabited and also made possible through his own work. Chrysovalantis and Lucien, thanks again for some fascinating interventions from, again, the two ends of the Mediterranean, for joining us from New Jersey, Cyprus, Saki from Toronto. Thanks to all of you for staying with us on a Friday night. Enjoy the rest of your day or of your night. Lucien, enjoy your Black Friday in the US. And as 2021 is nearing towards a close, I think this particular conversation has indicated how many worlds are out there for all of us actually to explore. So thanks again to all of you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.